This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. Perfume of a girl. Hathor said no word, either then or all that day. He stood till sunset like a tree trunk and thought of other things. Then the girl grew passionate and shook her curls. She rose from where she was sitting. She looked at him and touched his arm, but he did not see her. She looked at him so that all the soul was in her eyes. And then she fell down dead. Hathor awoke from his thoughts and saw her lying, still warm, at his feet, a corpse. He passed to the mainland, but how, it is not related. Tiedemann shuddered. You too have met your wicked woman, Spadeville, but your method is a nobler one. Don't pity other women, said Spadeville, but love the right. Hathor also once conversed with Shaping. With the maker of the world, said Maskell thoughtfully, with the maker of pleasure. It is told how Shaping defended his world and tried to force Hathor to acknowledge loveliness and joy. But Hathor, answering all his marvelous speeches in a few concise, iron words, showed how this joy and beauty was but another name for the bestiality of souls wallowing in luxury and sloth. Shaping smiled and said, How comes it that your wisdom is greater than that of the master of wisdom? Hathor said, My wisdom does not come from you, nor from your world, but from that other world which you, Shaping, have vainly tried to imitate. Shaping replied, What then do you do in my world? Hathor said, I am here falsely, and therefore I am subject to your false pleasures, but I wrap myself in pain, not because it is good, but because I wish to keep myself as far from you as possible. For pain is not yours, neither does it belong to the other world, but it is the shadow cast by your false pleasures. Shaping thus said, What is this faraway other world of which you say, This is so, this is not so? How happens it that you alone of all my creatures have knowledge of it? But Hathor spat at his feet and said, You lie, Shaping. All have knowledge of it. You with your pretty toys alone obscure it from our view. Shaping asked, What then am I? Hathor answered, You are the dreamer of impossible dreams. And then the story goes that Shaping departed, ill-pleased with what had been said. What other world did Hathor refer to? Asked Maskell. One where grandeur reigns, Maskell, just as pleasure reigns here. Whether grandeur or pleasure, it makes no difference, said Maskell. The individual spirit that lives and wishes to live is mean and corrupt-natured. Guard you your pride, returned Spadeville. Do not make law for the universe and for all time, but for yourself and for this small, false life of yours. In what shape did death come to that hard, unconquerable man? Asked Tiedemann. He lived to be old, but went upright and free-limbed to his last hour. When he saw that death could not be staved off longer, he determined to destroy himself. He gathered his friends around him, not from vanity, but that they might see to what lengths the human soul can go in its perpetual warfare with the voluptuous body. Standing erect, without support, he died by withholding his breath. A silence followed, which lasted for perhaps an hour. Their minds refused to acknowledge the icy winds, but the current of their thoughts became frozen. When Branchspell, however, shone out again, though with subdued power, Maskell's curiosity rose once more. Your fellow countrymen, then, Spadeville, are sick with self-love. The men of other countries, said Spadeville, are the slaves of pleasure and desire, knowing it. But the men of my country are the slaves of pleasure and desire, not knowing it. And yet that proud pleasure, which rejoices in self-torture, has something noble in it. He who studies himself at all is ignoble. Only by despising soul as well as body can a man enter into true life. On what grounds do they reject women? Inasmuch as a woman has ideal love and cannot live for herself. Love for another is pleasure for the loved one, and therefore injurious to him. A forest of false ideas is waiting for your axe, said Maskell. But will they allow it? Spadeville knows, Maskell, said Tydomin, that be it today or be it tomorrow, love can't be kept out of a land, even by the disciples of Hathor. Beware of love, beware of emotion, exclaimed Spadeville. Love is but pleasure once removed. Think not of pleasing others, but of serving them. Forgive me, Spadeville, if I am still feminine. Right has no sex. So long, Tydomin, as you remember that you are a woman, so long you will not enter into divine apathy of soul. But where there are no women, there are no children, said Maskell. How came there to be all these generations of Hathor men? Life breeds passion, passion breeds suffering, suffering breeds the yearning for relief from suffering. Men throng to Sant from all parts in order to have the scars of their souls healed. In place of hatred of pleasure, which all can understand, what simple formula do you offer? Iron obedience to duty, answered Spadeville. And if they ask, how far is this consistent with hatred of pleasure? What will your pronouncement be? I do not answer them, but I answer you, Maskell, who ask the question. Hatred is passion, and all passion springs from the dark fires of self. Do not hate pleasure at all, but pass it by on one side, calm and undisturbed. What is the criterion of pleasure? How can we always recognize it in order to avoid it? Rigidly follow duty, and such questions will not arise. Later in the afternoon, Tydomin timidly placed her fingers on Spadeville's arm. Fearful doubts are in my mind, she said. This expedition to Sant may turn out badly. I have seen a vision of you, Spadeville, and myself, lying dead and covered in blood, but Maskell was not there. We may drop the torch, but it will not be extinguished, and others will raise it. Show me a sign that you are not as other men, so that I may know that our blood will not be wasted. Spadeville regarded her sternly. I am not a magician. I don't persuade the senses, but the soul. Does your duty call you to Sant, Tydomin? Then go there. Does it not call you to Sant? Then go no farther. Is not this simple? What signs are necessary? Did I not see you dispel those spouts of lightning? No common man could have done that. Who knows what any man can do? This man can do one thing. That man can do another. But what all men can do is their duty. And to open their eyes to this, I must go to Sant, and if necessary, lay down my life. Will you not still accompany me? Yes, said Tydomin. I will follow you to the end. It is all the more essential because I keep on displeasing you with my remarks, and that means I have not yet learned my lesson properly. Do not be humble, for humility is only self-judgment, and while we are thinking of self, we must be neglecting some action we could be planning or shaping in our mind. Tydomin continued to be uneasy and preoccupied. Why was Maskell not in the picture? She asked. You dwell on this foreboding because you imagine it is tragical. There is nothing tragical in death, Tydomin, nor in life. There is only right and wrong. What arises from right or wrong action does not matter. We are not gods constructing a world, but simple men and women doing our immediate duty. We may die in Sant, so you have seen it, but the truth will go on living. Spadeville, why do you choose Sant to start your work in? Asked Maskell. These men with fixed ideas seem to me the least likely of any to follow a new light. Where a bad tree thrives, a good tree will flourish. But where no tree at all can be found, nothing will grow. I understand you, said Maskell. Here perhaps we are going to martyrdom, but elsewhere we should resemble men preaching to cattle. Shortly before sunset, they arrived at the extremity of the upland plain, above which towered the black cliffs of the Sant Levels. A dizzy, artificially constructed staircase of more than 1,000 steps of varying depth, twisting and forking in order to conform to the angles of the precipices, led to the world overhead. In the place where they stood, they were sheltered from the cutting winds. Branch spell, radiantly shining at last, but on the point of sinking, filled the cloudy sky with violent, lurid colors, some of the combinations of which were new to Maskell. The circle of the horizon was so gigantic that had he been suddenly carried back to Earth, he would by comparison have fancied himself to be moving beneath the dome of some little closed-in cathedral. He realized that he was on a foreign planet, but he was not stirred or uplifted by the knowledge. He was conscious only of moral ideas. Looking backward, he saw the plain, which for several miles past had been without vegetation, stretching back away to Discorn. So regular had been the ascent, and so great was the distance, that the huge pyramid looked nothing more than a slight swelling on the face of the earth. Spadeville stopped and gazed over the landscape in silence. In the evening sunlight, his form looked more dense, dark, and real than ever before. His features were set hard in grimness. He turned around to his companions. "What is the greatest wonder in all this wonderful scene?" he demanded. "Acquaint us," said Maskell. "All that you see is born from pleasure and moves on from pleasure to pleasure. Nowhere is right to be found. It is Shaping's world." "There is another wonder," said Tydomin, and she pointed her finger toward the sky overhead. A small cloud, so low down that it was perhaps not more than 500 feet above them, was sailing along in front of the dark wall of cliff. It was in the exact shape of an open human hand, with downward pointing fingers. It was stained crimson by the sun, and one or two tiny cloudlets beneath the fingers looked like falling drops of blood. "Who can doubt now that our death is close at hand?" said Tydomin. "I have been close to death twice today. The first time I was ready, but now I am more ready, for I shall die side by side with the man who has given me my first happiness." "Do not think of death, but of right persistence," replied Spadeville. "I am not here to tremble before Shaping's portents, but to snatch men from him." He at once proceeded to lead the way up the staircase. Tydomin gazed upward after him for a moment, with an odd, worshipping light in her eyes. Then she followed him, the second of the party. Maskell climbed last. He was travel-stained, unkempt, and very tired, but his soul was at peace. As they steadily ascended the almost perpendicular stairs, the sun got higher in the sky. Its light dyed their bodies a ruddy gold. They gained the top. There, they found rolling in front of them, as far as the eye could see, a barren desert of white sand, broken here and there by large, jagged masses of black rock. Tracts of the sand were reddened by the sinking sun. The vast expanse of sky was filled by evil-shaped clouds and wild colors. The freezing wind, flurrying across the desert, drove the fine particles of sand painfully against their faces. "Where now do you take us?" asked Maskell. "He who guards the old wisdom of Sant must give up that wisdom to me, that I may change it. What he says, others will say. I go to find Malgar." "And where will you seek him in this bare country?" Spadeville struck off toward the north unhesitatingly. "It is not so far," he said. "It is his custom to be in that part where Sant overhangs the Womflash forest. Perhaps he will be there, but I cannot say." Maskell glanced toward Tydomin. Her sunken cheeks and the dark circles beneath her eyes told of her extreme weariness. "The woman is tired, Spadeville," he said. She smiled. "It's but another step into the land of death. I can manage it. Give me your arm, Maskell." He put his arm around her waist and supported her along that way. "The sun is now sinking," said Maskell. "Will we get there before dark?" "Fear nothing, Maskell and Tydomin. This pain is eating up the evil in your nature. The road you are walking cannot remain unwalked. We shall arrive before dark." The sun then disappeared behind the far distant ridges that form the western boundary of the Ifton Marest. The sky blazed up into more vivid colors. The wind grew colder. They passed some pools of colorless knoll water, round the banks of which were planted fruit trees. Maskell ate some of the fruit. It was hard, bitter, and astringent. He could not get rid of the taste, but he felt braced and invigorated by the downward-flowing juices. No other trees or shrubs were to be seen anywhere. No animals appeared, no birds or insects. It was a desolate land. A mile or two passed, when they again approached the edge of the plateau. Far down, beneath their feet, the great Womflash forest began. But daylight had vanished there. Maskell's eyes rested only on a vague darkness. He faintly heard what sounded like the distant sighing of innumerable treetops. In the rapidly darkening twilight, they came abruptly on a man. He was standing in a pool on one leg. A pile of boulders had hidden him from their view. The water came as far up as his calf. A trifork, similar to the one Maskell had seen on Discorn, but smaller, had been stuck in the mud close by his hand. They stopped by the side of the pond and waited. Immediately he became aware of their presence. The man set down his other leg and waded out of the water toward them, picking up his trifork in doing so. "This is not Molger, but Katis," said Spadeville. "Molger is dead," said Katis, speaking the same tongue as Spadeville, but with an even harsher accent, so that the tympanum of Maskell's ear was affected painfully. The latter saw before him a bowed, powerful individual, advanced in years. He wore nothing but a scanty loincloth. His trunk was long and heavy, but his legs were rather short. His face was beardless, lemon-colored, and anxious-looking. It was disfigured by a number of longitudinal ruts, a quarter of an inch deep, the cavities of which seemed clogged with ancient dirt. The hair of his head was black and sparse. Instead of the twin membranous organs of Spadeville, he possessed but one, and this was in the center of his brow. Spadeville's dark, solid person stood out from the rest like a reality among dreams. "Has the trifork passed to you?" he demanded. "Yes. Why have you brought this woman to Sant?" "I have brought another thing to Sant. I have brought the new faith." Katis stood motionless and looked troubled. "State it. Shall I speak with many words or few words? If you wish to say what is not, many words will not suffice. If you wish to say what is, a few words will be enough." Spadeville frowned. "To hate pleasure brings pride with it. Pride is a pleasure. To kill pleasure, we must attach ourselves to duty. While the mind is planning right action, it has no time to think of pleasure." "Is that the whole?" asked Katis. "The truth is simple, even for the simplest man. Do you destroy Hathor and all his generations with a single word? I destroy nature and set up law." A long silence followed. "My probe is double," said Spadeville. "Suffer me to double yours, and you will see as I see. "Come you here, you big man," said Katis to Maskell. Maskell advanced a step closer. "Do you follow Spadeville in his new faith?" "As far as death," exclaimed Maskell. Katis picked up a flint. "With this stone, I strike out one of your 2 probes. When you have but one, you will see with me, and you will recollect with Spadeville. Choose you then the superior faith, and I shall obey your choice. Endure this little pain, Maskell, for the sake of future men," said Spadeville. "The pain is nothing," replied Maskell, "but I fear the result. Permit me, although I am only a woman, to take his place, Katis," said Tydomin, stretching out her hand. He struck at it violently with the flint and gashed it from wrist to thumb. The pale carmine blood spouted up. "What brings this kiss-lover to Sant?" he said. "How does she presume to make the rules of life for the sons of Hathor?" She bit her lip and stepped back. "Well then, Maskell, accept. I certainly should not have played false to Spadeville, but you hardly can. If he bids me, I must do it," said Maskell. "But who knows what will come of it?" Spadeville spoke. "Of all the descendants of Hathor, Katis is the most wholehearted and sincere. He will trample my truth underfoot, thinking me a demon sent by Shaping to destroy the work of this land. But a seed will escape, and my blood and yours, Tydomin, will wash it. Then men will know that my destroying evil is their greatest good. But none here will live to see that." Maskell now went quite close to Katis and offered his head. Katis raised his hand, and after holding the flint poised for a moment, brought it down with adroitness and force upon the left-hand shenprobe. Maskell cried out with the pain. The blood streamed down, and the function of the organ was destroyed. There was a pause, while he walked to and fro, trying to staunch the blood. "What now do you feel, Maskell? What do you see?" inquired Tydomin anxiously. He stopped and stared hard at her. "I now see straight," he said slowly. "What does that mean?" He continued to wipe the blood from his forehead. He looked troubled. "Henceforward, as long as I live, I shall fight with my nature and refuse to feel pleasure, and I advise you to do the same." Spadeville gazed at him sternly. "Do you renounce my teaching?" Maskell, however, returned the gaze without dismay. Spadeville's image-like clearness of form had departed for him. His frowning face he knew to be the deceptive portico of a weak and confused intellect. "It is false." "Is it false to sacrifice oneself for another?" demanded Tydomin. "I can't argue as yet," said Maskell. "At this moment, the world with its sweetness seems to me a sort of charnel house. I feel a loathing for everything in it, including myself. I know no more." "Is there no duty?" asked Spadeville in a harsh tone. "It appears to me but a cloak under which we share the pleasure of other people." Tydomin pulled at Spadeville's arm. "Maskell has betrayed you, as he has so many others. Let us go." He stood fast. "You have changed quickly, Maskell." Maskell, without answering him, turned to Katis. "Why do men go on living in this soft, shameful world when they can kill themselves? Pain is the native air of Surtur's children. To what other air do you wish to escape?" "Surtur's children? Is not Surtur Shaping? It is the greatest of lies. It is Shaping's masterpiece." "Answer, Maskell," said Spadeville. "Do you repudiate right action?" "Leave me alone. Go back. I am not thinking of you and your ideas. I wish you no harm." The darkness came on fast. There was another prolonged silence. Katis threw away the flint and picked up his staff. "The woman must return home," he said. "She was persuaded here and did not come freely. You, Spadeville, must die, backslider as you are." Tiedemann said quietly, "He has no power to enforce this. Are you going to allow the truth to fall to the ground, Spadeville? It will not perish by my death, but by my efforts to escape from death. Katis, I accept your judgment." Tiedemann smiled. "For my part, I am too tired to walk farther today, so I shall die with him." Katis said to Maskell, "Prove your sincerity. Kill this man and his mistress, according to the laws of Hathor." "I can't do that. I have traveled in friendship with them." "You denied duty, and now you must do your duty," said Spadeville, calmly stroking his beard. "Whatever law you accept, you must obey, without turning to right or left. Your law commands that we must be stoned, and it will soon be dark." "Have you not even this amount of manhood?" exclaimed Tiedemann. Maskell moved heavily. "Be my witness, Katis, that the thing was forced on me." "Hatter is looking on and approving," replied Katis. Maskell then went apart to the pile of boulders scattered by the side of the pool. He glanced about him and selected 2 large fragments of rock, the heaviest that he thought he could carry. With these in his arms, he staggered back. He dropped them on the ground and stood, recovering his breath. When he could speak again, he said, "I have a bad heart for the business. Is there no alternative? Sleep here tonight, Spadeville, and in the morning go back to where you have come from. No one shall harm you." Spadeville's ironic smile was lost in the gloom. "Shall I brood again, Maskell, for still another year, and after that come back to Sant with other truths? Come, waste no time, but choose the heavier stone for me, for I am stronger than Tiedemann." Maskell lifted one of the rocks and stepped out 4 full paces. Spadeville confronted him, erect, and waited tranquilly. The huge stone hurtled through the air. Its flight looked like a dark shadow. It struck Spadeville full in the face, crushing his features and breaking his neck. He died instantaneously. Tiedemann looked away from the fallen man. "Be very quick, Maskell, and don't let me keep him waiting." He panted and raised the second stone. She placed herself in front of Spadeville's body and stood there, unsmiling and cold. The blow caught her between breast and chin, and she fell. Maskell went to her, and kneeling on the ground, half raised her in his arms. There she breathed out her last sighs. After that, he laid her down again, and rested heavily on his hands, while he peered into the dead face. The transition from its heroic, spiritual expression to the vulgar and grinning mask of Crystal Man came like a flash. But he saw it. He stood up in the darkness and pulled Katis toward him. Is that the true likeness of shaping? It is shaping stripped of illusion. How comes this horrible world to exist? Katis did not answer. Who is Surtur? You will get nearer to him tomorrow, but not here. I am wading through too much blood, said Maskell. Nothing good can come of it. Do not fear change and destruction, but laughter and joy. Maskell meditated. Tell me, Katis, if I had elected to follow Spadeville, would you really have accepted his faith? He was a great-souled man, replied Katis. I see that the pride of our men is only another sprouting out of pleasure. Tomorrow I, too, shall leave Sant to reflect on all this. Maskell shuddered. Then these 2 deaths were not a necessity, but a crime. His part was played, and henceforward the woman would have dragged down his ideas with her soft love and loyalty. Regret nothing, stranger, but go away at once out of the land. Tonight, where shall I go? To Womflash, where you will meet the deepest minds. I will put you on the way. He linked his arm in Maskell's, and they walked away into the night. For a mile or more they skirted the edge of the precipice. The wind was searching and drove grit into their faces. Through the rifts of the clouds, stars, faint and brilliant, appeared. Maskell saw no familiar constellations. He wondered if the sun of Earth was visible, and if so, which one it was. They came to the head of a rough staircase leading down the cliffside. It resembled the one by which he had come up, but this descended to the Womb-Flash forest. "That is your path," said Katis, "and I shall not come any farther." Maskell detained him. "Say just this, before we part company. Why does pleasure appear so shameful to us?" "Because in feeling pleasure, we forget our home. And that is Muspel," answered Katis. Having made this reply, he disengaged himself and, turning his back, disappeared into the darkness. Maskell stumbled down the staircase as best he could. He was tired, but contemptuous of his pains. His uninjured probe beat 310 Gain to discharge matter. He lowered himself from step to step during what seemed an interminable time. The rustling and sighing of the trees grew louder as he approached the bottom. The air became still and warm. He at last reached level ground. Still attempting to proceed, he began to trip over roots and to collide with tree trunks. After this had happened a few times, he determined to go no farther that night. He heaped together some dry leaves for a pillow and immediately flung himself down to sleep. Deep and heavy unconsciousness seized him almost instantly. Chapter 13. The Womb-Flash forest. He awoke to his third day on Tormance. His limbs ached. He lay on his side, looking stupidly at his surroundings. The forest was like night, but that period of the night when the gray dawn is about to break and objects begin to be guessed at, rather than seen. 2 or 3 amazing shadowy shapes, as broad as houses, loomed up out of the twilight. He did not realize that they were trees until he turned over on his back and followed their course upward. Far overhead, so high up that he dared not calculate the height, he saw their tops glittering in the sunlight against a tiny patch of blue sky. Clouds of mist rolling over the floor of the forest kept interrupting his view. In their silent passage, they were like phantoms flitting among the trees. The leaves underneath him were sodden, and heavy drops of moisture splashed onto his head from time to time. He continued lying there, trying to reconstruct the events of the preceding day. His brain was lethargic and confused. Something terrible had happened, but what it was he could not for a long time recollect. Then suddenly there came before his eyes that ghastly closing scene at dusk on the Saint Plateau. Spadeville's crushed and bloody features and Tideman's dying sighs. He shuddered convulsively and felt sick. The peculiar moral outlook that had dictated these brutal murders had departed from him during the night, and now he recognized what he had done. During the whole of the previous day, he seemed to have been laboring under a series of heavy enchantments. First Okiax had enslaved him, then Tidamine, then Spadeville, and lastly, Katis. They had forced him to murder and violate. He had guessed nothing, but had imagined that he was traveling as a free and enlightened stranger. What was this nightmare journey for, and would it continue in the same way? The silence of the forest was so intense that he heard no sound except the pumping of blood through his arteries. Putting his hand to his face, he found that his remaining probe had disappeared and that he was in possession of 3 eyes. The third eye was on his forehead, where the old sorb had been. He could not guess its use. He still had his third arm, but it was nerveless. Now he puzzled his head for a long time, trying unsuccessfully to recall that name which had been the last word spoken by Katis. He got up with the intention of resuming his journey. He had no toilet to make, and no meal to prepare. The forest was tremendous. The nearest tree appeared to him to have a circumference of at least 100 feet. Other dim boles looked equally large. But what gave the scene its aspect of immensity was the vast spaces separating tree from tree. It was like some gigantic supernatural hall in a life after death. The lowest branches were 50 yards or more from the ground. There was no underbrush. The soil was carpeted only by the dead, wet leaves. He looked all around him to find his direction, but the cliffs of Sant, which he had descended, were invisible. Every way was like every other way. He had no idea which quarter to attack. He grew frightened and muttered to himself. Craning his neck back, he stared upward and tried to discover the points of the compass from the direction of the sunlight. But it was impossible. While he was standing there, anxious and hesitating, he heard the drum taps. The rhythmical beats proceeded from some distance off. The unseen drummer seemed to be marching through the forest, away from him. "Surtur," he said under his breath. The next moment he marveled at himself for uttering the name. That mysterious being had not been in his thoughts, nor was there any ostensible connection between him and the drumming. He began to reflect, but in the meantime the sounds were traveling away. Automatically he started walking in the same direction. The drum beats had this peculiarity. Though odd and mystical, there was nothing awe-inspiring in them. But on the contrary, they reminded him of some place and some life with which he was perfectly familiar. Once again they caused all his other sense impressions to appear false. The sounds were intermittent. They would go on for a minute or for 5 minutes, and then cease for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Maskell followed them as well as he could. He walked hard among the huge, indistinct trees in the attempt to come up with the origin of the noise, but the same distance always seemed to separate them. The forest, from now onward, descended. The gradient was mostly gentle, about 1 foot in 10, but in some places it was much steeper, and in other parts again it was practically level ground for quite long stretches. There were great swampy marshes through which Maskell was obliged to splash. It was a matter of indifference to him how wet he became. If only he could catch sight of that individual with the drum. Mile after mile was covered, and still he was no nearer to doing so. The gloom of the forest settled down upon his spirits. He felt despondent, tired, and savage. He had not heard the drum beats for some while, and was half inclined to discontinue the pursuit. Passing around a great columnar tree trunk, he almost stumbled against a man who was standing on the farther side. He was leaning against the trunk with one hand, in an attitude of repose. His other hand was resting on a staff. Maskell stopped short and started at him. He was nearly naked and of gigantic build. He overtopped Maskell by a head. His face and body were faintly phosphorescent. His eyes, 3 in number, were pale green and luminous, shining like lamps. His skin was hairless, but the hair of his head was piled up in thick, black coils and fastened like a woman's. His features were absolutely tranquil, but a terrible, quiet energy seemed to lie just underneath the surface. Maskell addressed him. "Did the drumming come from you?" The man shook his head. "What is your name?" he replied in a strange, strained, twisted voice. Maskell gathered that the name he gave was Dream Sinter. "What is that drumming?" "Surtur," said Dream Sinter. "Is it advisable for me to follow it?" "Why?" "Perhaps he intends me to. He brought me here from Earth." Dream Sinter caught hold of him, bent down, and peered into his face. "Not you, but Nightspore." This was the first time that Maskell had heard Nightspore's name since his arrival on the planet. He was so astonished that he could frame no more questions. "Eat this," said Dream Center. "Then we will chase the sound together." He picked something up from the ground and handed it to Maskul. He could not see distinctly, but it felt like a hard, round nut of the size of a fist. "I can't crack it." Dream Center took it between his hands and broke it into pieces. Maskul then ate some of the pulpy interior, which was intensely disagreeable. "What am I doing in Tormance then?" he asked. "You came to steal Muspel fire, to give a deeper life to men, never doubting if your soul could endure that burning." Maskul could hardly decipher the strangled words. Muspel. That's the name I've been trying to remember ever since I awoke. Dream Center suddenly turned his head sideways and appeared to listen for something. He motioned with his hand to Maskul to keep quiet. "Is it the drumming?" "Hush. They come." He was looking toward the upper forest. The now familiar drum rhythm was heard, this time accompanied by the tramp of marching feet. Maskul saw, marching through the trees and heading toward them, 3 men in single file, separated from one another by only a yard or so. They were traveling downhill at a swift pace and looked neither to left nor right. They were naked. Their figures were shining against the black background of the forest, with a pale, supernatural light, green and ghostly. When they were abreast of him, about 20 feet off, he perceived who they were. The first man was himself, Maskul. The second was Crag. The third man was Nightspore. Their faces were grim and set. The source of the drumming was out of sight. The sound appeared to come from some point in front of them. Maskul and Dream Center put themselves in motion to keep up with the swiftly moving marchers. At the same time, a low, faint music began. Its rhythm stepped with the drum beats, but unlike the latter, it did not seem to proceed from any particular quarter of the forest. It resembled the subjective music heard in dreams, which accompanies the dreamer everywhere as a sort of natural atmosphere, rendering all his experiences emotional. It seemed to issue from an unearthly orchestra and was strongly troubled, pathetic, and tragic. Maskul marched and listened, and as he listened, it grew louder and stormier, but the pulse of the drum interpenetrated all the other sounds, like the quiet beating of reality. His emotion deepened. He could not have said if minutes or hours were passing. The spectral procession marched on, a little way ahead, on a path parallel with his own and Dream Center's. The music pulsated violently. Crag lifted his arm and displayed a long, murderous-looking knife. He sprang forward and, raising it over the phantom Maskul's back, stabbed him twice, leaving the knife in the wound the second time. Maskul threw up his arms and fell down dead. Crag leapt into the forest and vanished from sight. Nightspore marched on alone, stern and unmoved. The music rose to crescendo. The whole dim, gigantic forest was roaring with sound. The tones came from all sides, from above, from the ground under their feet. It was so grandly passionate that Maskul felt his soul loosening from its bodily envelope. He continued to follow Nightspore. A strange brightness began to glow in front of them. It was not daylight, but a radiance such as he had never seen before, and such as he could not have imagined to be possible. Nightspore moved straight toward it. Maskul felt his chest bursting. The light flashed higher. The awful harmonies of the music followed hard one upon another, like the waves of a wild, magic ocean. His body was incapable of enduring such shocks, and all of a sudden he tumbled over in a faint that resembled death. Chapter 14. Pole Crab. The morning slowly passed. Maskul made some convulsive movements and opened his eyes. He sat up, blinking. All was night-like and silent in the forest. The strange light had gone. The music had ceased. Dreamcenter had vanished. He fingered his beard, clotted with Tidman's blood, and fell into a deep muse. According to Panaway and Katish, this forest contains wise men. Perhaps Dreamcenter was one. Perhaps that vision I have just seen was a specimen of his wisdom. It looked almost like an answer to my question. I ought not to have asked about myself, but about Surtur. Then I would have got a different answer. I might have learned something. I might have seen him. He remained quiet and apathetic for a bit. But I couldn't face that awful glare. He proceeded. It was bursting my body. He warned me too, and so Surtur does really exist, and my journey stands for something. But why am I here, and what can I do? Who is Surtur? Where is he to be found? Something wild came into his eyes. What did Dreamcenter mean by his, not you, but Nightspore? Am I a secondary character? Is he regarded as important, and I as unimportant? Where is Nightspore, and what is he doing? Am I to wait for his time and pleasure? Can I originate nothing? He continued sitting up, with straight extended legs. I must make up my mind that this is a strange journey, and that the strangest things will happen in it. It's no use making plans, for I can't see the 2 steps ahead. Everything is unknown, but one thing's evident. Nothing but the wildest audacity will carry me through, and I must sacrifice everything else to that. And therefore, if Surtur shows himself again, I shall go forward to meet him, even if it means death. Through the black, quiet aisles of the forest, the drum beats came again. The sound was a long way off and very faint. It was like the last mutterings of thunder after a heavy storm. Maskell listened, without getting up. The drumming faded into silence and did not return. He smiled queerly and said aloud, "Thanks, Surtur. I accept the omen." When he was about to get up, he found that the shriveled skin that had been his third arm was flapping disconcertingly with every movement of his body. He made perforations in it all around, as close to his chest as possible, with the fingernails of both hands. Then he carefully twisted it off. In that world of rapid growth and ungrowth, he judged that the stump would soon disappear. After that, he rose and peered into the darkness. The forest at that point sloped rather steeply, and without thinking twice about it, he took the downhill direction, never doubting it would bring him somewhere. As soon as he started walking, his temper became gloomy and morose. He was shaken, tired, dirty, and languid with hunger. Moreover, he realized that the walk was not going to be a short one. Be that as it may, he determined to sit down no more until the whole dismal forest was at his back. One after another, the shadowy house-like trees were observed, avoided, and passed. Far overhead, the little patch of glowing sky was still always visible. Otherwise, he had no clue to the time of day. He continued tramping sullenly down the slope for many damp, slippery miles, in some places through bogs. When, presently, the twilight seemed to thin, he guessed that the open world was not far away. The forest grew more palpable and gray, and now he saw its majesty better. The tree trunks were like round towers, and so wide were the intervals that they resembled natural amphitheaters. He could not make out the color of the bark. Everything he saw amazed him, but his admiration was of the growling, grudging kind. The difference in light between the forest behind him and the forest ahead became so marked that he could no longer doubt that he was on the point of coming out. Real light was in front of him. Looking back, he found he had a shadow. The trunks acquired a reddish tint. He quickened his pace. As the minutes went by, the bright patch ahead grew luminous and vivid. It had a tinge of blue. He also imagined that he heard the sound of surf. All that part of the forest toward which he was moving became rich with color. The boles of the trees were of a deep, dark red. Their leaves, high above his head, were ulfire-hued. The dead leaves on the ground were of a color he could not name. At the same time, he discovered the use of his third eye. By adding a third angle to his sight, every object he looked at stood out in greater relief. The world looked less flat, more realistic and significant. He had a stronger attraction toward his surroundings. He seemed somehow to lose his egotism and to become free and thoughtful. Now, through the last trees, he saw full daylight. Less than half a mile separated him from the border of the forest, and, eager to discover what lay beyond, he broke into a run. He heard the surf louder. It was a peculiar hissing sound that could proceed only from water, yet was unlike the sea. Almost immediately, he came within sight of an enormous horizon of dancing waves, which he knew must be the sinking sea. He fell back into a quick walk, continuing to stare hard. The wind that met him was hot, fresh, and sweet. When he arrived at the final fringe of forest, which joined the wide sands of the shore without any change of level, he leaned with his back to a great tree and gazed his fill, motionless, at what lay in front of him. The sands continued east and west in a straight line, broken only here and there by a few creeks. They were of a brilliant orange color, but there were patches of violet. The forest appeared to stand sentinel over the shore for its entire length. Everything else was sea and sky. He had never seen so much water. The semicircle of the skyline was so vast that he might have imagined himself on a flat world, with a range of vision determined only by the power of his eye. The sea was unlike any sea on earth. It resembled an immense liquid opal. On a body color of rich, magnificent emerald green, flashes of red, yellow, and blue were everywhere, shooting up and vanishing. The wave motion was extraordinary. Pinnacles of water were slowly formed until they attained a height of perhaps 10 or 20 feet, when they would suddenly sink downward and outward, creating in their descent a series of concentric rings for long distances around them. Quickly moving currents, like rivers in the sea, could be seen, racing away from land. They were of a darker green and bore no pinnacles. Where the sea met the shore, the waves rushed over the sands far in with almost sinister rapidity, accompanied by a weird, hissing, spitting sound, which was what Maskell had heard. The green tongues rolled in without foam. About 20 miles distant, as he judged, directly opposite him, a long, low island stood up from the sea, black and not distinguished in outline. It was Swaylone's island. Maskell was less interested in that than in the blue sunset that glowed behind its back. Alpane had set, but the whole northern sky was plunged into the minor key by its afterlight. Branchspel in the zenith was white and overpowering. The day was cloudless and terrifically hot, but where the blue sun had sunk, a somber shadow seemed to overhang the world. Maskell had a feeling of disintegration, just as if two chemically distinct forces were simultaneously acting upon the cells of his body. Since the afterglow of Alpane affected him like this, he thought it more than likely that he would never be able to face that sun itself and go on living. Still, some modification might happen to him that would make it possible. The sea tempted him. He made up his mind to bathe, and at once walked toward the shore. The instant he stepped outside the shadow line of the forest trees, the blinding rays of the sun beat down on him so savagely that for a few minutes he felt sick and his head swam. He trod quickly across the sands. The orange-colored parts were nearly hot enough to roast food, he judged, but the violet parts were like fire itself. He stepped on a patch in ignorance and immediately jumped high into the air with a startled yell. The sea was voluptuously warm. It would not bear his weight, so he determined to try swimming. First of all, he stripped off his skin garment, washed it thoroughly with sand and water, and laid it in the sun to dry. Then he scrubbed himself as well as he could and washed out his beard and hair. After that, he waded in a long way until the water reached his breast and took to swimming. Avoiding the spouts as far as possible, he found it no pastime. The water was everywhere of unequal density. In some places he could swim. In others he could barely save himself from drowning. In others again he could not force himself beneath the surface at all. There were no outward signs to show what the water ahead held in store for him. The whole business was most dangerous. He came out, feeling clean and invigorated. For a time he walked up and down the sands, drying himself in the hot sunshine and looking around him. He was a naked stranger in a huge, foreign, mystical world, and whichever way he turned, unknown and threatening forces were glaring at him. The gigantic, white, withering branch spell, the awful, body-changing alpine, the beautiful, deadly, treacherous sea, the dark and eerie Swalones Island, the spirit-crushing forest out of which he had just escaped. To all these mighty powers surrounding him on every side, what resources had he, a feeble, ignorant traveler, to oppose from a tiny planet on the other side of space to avoid being utterly destroyed? Then he smiled to himself. I've already been here 2 days and still I survive. I have luck, and with that one can balance the universe. But what is luck? A verbal expression, or a thing? As he was putting on his skin, which was now dry, the answer came to him, and this time he was grave. Surtur brought me here, and Surtur is watching over me. That is my luck. But what is Surtur in this world? How is he able to protect me against the blind and ungovernable forces of nature? Is he stronger than nature? Hungry as he was for food, he was hungrier still for human society, for he wished to inquire about all these things. He asked himself which way he should turn his steps. There were only 2 ways, along the shore, either east or west. The near 331S Creek lay to the east, cutting the sands about a mile away. He walked toward it. The forest face was forbidding and enormously high. It was so squarely turned to the sea that it looked as though it had been planed by tools. Maskell strode along in the shade of the trees, but kept his head constantly turned away from them toward the sea. There it was more cheerful. The creek, when he reached it, proved to be broad and flat-banked. It was not a river, but an arm of the sea. Its still, dark green water curved around a bend out of sight. Into the forest, the trees on both banks overhung the water, so that it was completely in shadow. He went as far as the bend, beyond which another short reach appeared. A man was sitting on a narrow shelf of bank, with his feet in the water. He was clothed in a coarse, rough hide, which left his limbs bare. He was short, thick, and sturdy, with short legs and long, powerful arms, terminating in hands of an extraordinary size. He was oldish. His face was plain, slab-like, and expressionless. It was full of wrinkles and walnut-colored. Both face and head were bald, and his skin was tough and leathery. He seemed to be some sort of peasant or fisherman. There was no trace in his face of thought for others or delicacy of feeling. He possessed 3 eyes of different colors: jade green, blue, and ulfire. In front of him, riding on the water, moored to the bank, was an elementary raft consisting of the branches of trees clumsily corded together. Maskell addressed him. "Are you another of the wise men of the Wombflash Forest?" The man answered him in a gruff, husky voice, looking up as he did so. "I'm a fisherman. I know nothing about wisdom. What name do you go by?" "Polecrab. What's yours?" "Maskell. If you're a fisherman, you ought to have fish. I'm famishing." Polecrab grunted and paused a minute before answering. "There's fish enough. My dinner is cooking in the sands now. It's easy enough to get you some more." Maskell found this a pleasant speech. "But how long will it take?" he asked. The man slid the palms of his hands together, producing a shrill, screeching noise. He lifted his feet from the water and clambered onto the bank. In a minute or two, a curious little beast came crawling up to his feet, turning its face and eyes up affectionately, like a dog. It was about 2 feet long and somewhat resembled a small seal, but had 6 legs, ending in strong claws. "Arg, go fish," said Polecrab hoarsely. The animal immediately tumbled off the bank into the water. It swam gracefully to the middle of the creek and made a pivotal dive beneath the surface, where it remained a great while. "Simple fishing," remarked Maskell. "But what's the raft for?" "To go to sea with. The best fish are out at sea. These are eatable." "That Arg seems a highly intelligent creature." Polecrab grunted again. "I've trained close on 100 of them. The big heads learn best, but they're slow swimmers. The narrowheads swim like eels but can't be taught. Now I've started interbreeding them. He's one of them." "Do you live here alone?" "No, I've got a wife and 3 boys. My wife's sleeping somewhere, but where the lads are, Shaping knows." Maskell began to feel very much at home with this unsophisticated being. "The raft's all crazy," he remarked, staring at it. "If you go far out in that, you've got more pluck than I have." "I've been to Matterplay on it," said Polecrab. The Arg reappeared and started swimming to shore, but this time clumsily, as if it were bearing a heavy weight under the surface. When it landed at its master's feet, they saw that each set of claws was clutching a fish, 6 in all. Polecrab took them from it. He proceeded to cut off the heads and tails with a sharp-edged stone, which he picked up. These he threw to the Arg, which devoured them without any fuss. Polecrab beckoned to Maskell to follow him, and carrying the fish, walked toward the open shore, by the same way that he had come. When they reached the sands, he sliced the fish, removed the entrails, and digging a shallow hole in a patch of violet sand, placed the remainder of the carcasses in it, and covered them over again. Then he dug up his own dinner. Maskell's nostrils quivered at the savory smell, but he was not yet to dine. Polecrab, turning to go with the cooked fish in his hands, said, "These are mine, not yours. When yours are done, you can come back and join me, supposing you want company." "How soon will that be?" "About 20 minutes, replied the fisherman over his shoulder. Maskell sheltered himself in the shadows of the forest and waited. When the time had approximately elapsed, he disinterred his meal, scorching his fingers in the operation, although it was only the surface of the sand, which was so intensely hot. Then he returned to Polecrab. In the warm, still air and cheerful shade of the inlet, they munched in silence, looking from their food to the sluggish water and back again. With every mouthful, Maskell felt his strength returning. He finished before Polecrab, who ate like a man for whom time has no value. When he had done, he stood up. "Come and drink," he said in his husky voice. Maskell looked at him inquiringly. The man led him a little way into the forest and walked straight up to a certain tree. At a convenient height in its trunk, a hole had been tapped and plugged. Polecrab removed the plug and put his mouth to the aperture, sucking for quite a long time, like a child at its mother's breast. Maskell, watching him, imagined that he saw his eyes growing brighter. When his own turn came to drink, he found the juice of the tree somewhat like coconut milk in flavor, but intoxicating. It was a new sort of intoxication, however, for neither his will nor his emotions were excited, but only his intellect, and that only in a certain way. His thoughts and images were not freed and loosened, but on the contrary, kept laboring and swelling painfully until they reached the full beauty of an aparusic, which would then flame up in his consciousness, burst, and vanish. After that, the whole process started over again, but there was never a moment when he was not perfectly cool and master of his senses. When each had drunk twice, Polecrab replugged the hole, and they returned to their bank. "Is it blood somber yet?" asked Maskell, sprawling on the ground, well content. Polecrab resumed his old upright sitting posture, with his feet in the water. "Just beginning," was his hoarse response. "Then I must stay here till it's over. Shall we talk?" "We can," said the other, without enthusiasm. Maskell glanced at him through half-closed lids, wondering if he were exactly what he seemed to be. In his eyes he thought he detected a wise light. "Have you traveled much, Polecrab?" "Not what you would call traveling." "You tell me you've been to Matterplay. What kind of country is that?" "I don't know. I went there to pick up flints." "What countries lie beyond it?" "Threel comes next, as you go north. They say it's a land of mystics." "I don't know." "Mystics?" "So I'm told. Still farther north there's Lichtstorm. Now we're going far afield. There are mountains there, and altogether it must be a very dangerous place, especially for a full-blooded man like you. Take care of yourself." "This is rather premature, Polecrab. How do you know I'm going there? As you've come from the south, I suppose you'll go north." "Well, that's right enough," said Maskell, staring hard at him. "But how do you know I've come from the south?" "Well then, perhaps you haven't, but there's a look of Ifdawn about you." "What kind of look?" "A tragical look," said Polecrab. He never even glanced at Maskell, but was gazing at a fixed spot on the water with unblinking eyes. "What lies beyond Lichtstorm?" asked Maskell after a minute or two. "Bere, where you have 2 sons instead of 1. But beyond that fact, I know nothing about it. Then comes the ocean. And what's on the other side of the ocean? That you must find out for yourself, for I doubt if anybody has ever crossed it and come back." Maskell was silent for a little while. "How is it that your people are so unadventurous? I seem to be the only one traveling from curiosity." "What do you mean by your people?" "True. You don't know that I don't belong to your planet at all. I've come from another world, Polecrab. What to find? I came here with Crag and Nightspore to follow Surtur. I must have fainted the moment I arrived. When I sat up, it was night, and the others had vanished. Since then, I've been traveling at random." Polecrab scratched his nose. "You haven't found Surtur yet?" "I've heard his drum taps frequently. In the forest this morning, I came quite close to him. Then 2 days ago, in the Lusian Plain, I saw a vision, a being in man's shape, who called himself Surtur." "Well, maybe it was Surtur." "No, that's impossible," replied Maskell reflectively. "It was Crystal Man, and it isn't a question of my suspecting it, I know it." "How?" "Because this is Crystalman's world, and Surtur's world is something quite different." "That's queer, then," said Polecrab. "Since I've come out of that forest," proceeded Maskell, talking half to himself, "a change has come over me, and I see things differently. Everything here looks much more solid and real in my eyes than in other places, so much so that I can't entertain the least doubt of its existence. It not only looks real, It is real, and on that I would stake my life. But at the same time that it's real, it is false. Like a dream. No, not at all like a dream, and that's just what I want to explain. This world of yours, and perhaps of mine too, for that matter, doesn't give me the slightest impression of a dream, or an illusion, or anything of that sort. I know it's really here at this moment, and it's exactly as we're seeing it, you and I. Yet it's false. It's false in this sense, Pole Crab. Side by side with it, another world exists, and that other world is the true one, and this one is all false and deceitful to the very core. And so it occurs to me that reality and falseness are two words for the same thing. Perhaps there is such another world, said Pole Crab huskily. But did that vision also seem real and false to you? Very real, but not false then. For then I didn't understand all this. But just because it was real, it couldn't have been Surtur, who has no connection with reality. Didn't those drum taps sound real to you? I had to hear them with my ears, and so they sounded real to me. Still, they were somehow different, and they certainly came from Surtur. If I didn't hear them correctly, that was my fault, and not his. Pole Crab growled a little. If Surtur chooses to speak to you in that fashion, it appears he's trying to say something. What else can I think? But Pole Crab, what's your opinion? Is he calling me to the life after death? The old man stirred uneasily. I'm a fisherman, he said, after a minute or two. I live by killing, and so does everybody. This life seems to me all wrong. So maybe life of any kind is wrong, and Surtur's world is not life at all, but something else. Yes, but will death lead me to it, whatever it is? Ask the dead, said Pole Crab, and not a living man. Maskell continued. In the forest I heard music and saw a light, which could not have belonged to this world. They were too strong for my senses, and I must have fainted for a long time. There was a vision as well, in which I saw myself killed, while Nightspore walked on toward the light, alone. Pole Crab uttered his grunt. You have enough to think over. A short silence ensued, which was broken by Maskell. So strong is my sense of the untruth of this present life, that it may come to my putting an end to myself. The fisherman remained quiet and immobile. Maskell lay on his stomach, propped his face on his hands, and stared at him. What do you think, Pole Crab? Is it possible for any man, while in the body, to gain a closer view of that other world than I have done? I am an ignorant man, stranger, so I can't say. Perhaps there are many others like you who would gladly know. Where? I should like to meet them. Do you think you were made of one stuff, and the rest of mankind of another stuff? I can't be so presumptuous. Possibly all men are reaching out toward Muspel, in most cases without being aware of it. In the wrong direction, said Pole Crab. Maskell gave him a strange look. How so? I don't speak from my own wisdom, said Pole Crab, for I have none. But I have just now recalled what Broodvile once told me, when I was a young man, and he was an old one. He said that Crystal Man tries to turn all things into one, and that whichever way his shapes march, in order to escape from him, they find themselves again face to face with Crystal Man, and are changed into new crystals, but that this marching of shapes, which we call forking, springs from the unconscious desire to find Surtur, but is in the opposite direction to the right one, for Surtur's world does not lie on this side of the one, which was the beginning of life, but on the other side, and to get to it, we must repass through the one. But this can only be by renouncing our self-life and reuniting ourselves to the whole. of Crystal Man's world. And when this has been done, it is only the first stage of the journey, though many good men imagine it to be the whole journey. As far as I can remember, that is what Broodvile said, but perhaps, as I was then a young and ignorant man, I may have left out words which would explain his meaning better. Maskell, who had listened attentively to all this, remained thoughtful at the end. "It's plain enough," he said, "but what did he mean by our reuniting ourselves to Crystal Man's world? If it is false, are we to make ourselves false as well? I didn't ask him that question, and you are as well qualified to answer it as I am. He must have meant that, as it is, we are each of us living in a false private world of our own, a world of dreams and appetites and distorted perceptions. By embracing the great world, we certainly lose nothing in truth and reality." Polcrab withdrew his feet from the water, stood up, yawned, and stretched his limbs. "I have told you all I know," he said in a surly voice. "Now let me go to sleep." Maskell kept his eyes fixed on him, but made no reply. The old man let himself down stiffly onto the ground and prepared to rest. While he was still arranging his position to his liking, a footfall sounded behind the two men, coming from the direction of the forest. Maskell twisted his neck and saw a woman approaching them. He at once guessed that it was Polcrab's wife. He sat up, but the fisherman did not stir. The woman came and stood in front of them, looking down from what appeared a great height. Her dress was similar to her husband's, but covered her limbs more. She was young, tall, slender, and strikingly erect. Her skin was lightly tanned, and she looked strong, but not at all peasant-like. Refinement was stamped all over her. Her face had too much energy of expression for a woman, and she was not beautiful. Her 3 great eyes kept flashing and glowing. She had great masses of fine, yellow hair, coiled up and fastened, but so carelessly that some of the strands were flowing down her back. When she spoke, it was in a rather weak voice, but full of lights and shades, and somehow intense passionateness never seemed to be far away from it. "Forgiveness is asked for listening to your conversation," she said, addressing Maskell. "I was resting behind the tree, and heard it all." He got up slowly. "Are you Polcrab's wife?" "She is my wife," said Polcrab, "and her name is Gleemeal." "Sit down again, stranger, and you too, wife, since you are here." They both obeyed. "I heard everything," repeated Gleemeal, "but what I did not hear was where you are going to, Maskell, after you have left us. I know no more than you do. Listen then, there's only one place for you to go to, and that is Swalone's Island. I will ferry you across myself before sunset. What shall I find there?" "He may go, wife," put in the old man hoarsely, "but I won't allow you to go. I will take him over myself." "No, you have always put me off," said Gleemeal with some emotion. "This time I mean to go. When Tyrgeld shines at night, and I sit on the shore here, listening to Earthrid's music traveling faintly across the sea, I am tortured. I can't endure it. I have long since made up my mind to go to the island and see what this music is. If it's bad, if it kills me, well, what have I to do with the man and his music, Gleemeal?" demanded Maskell. "I think the music will answer all your questions better than Polcrab has done, and possibly in a way that will surprise you." "What kind of music can it be to travel all those miles across the sea?" "A peculiar kind, so we are told. Not pleasant, but painful, and the man that can play the instrument of Earthrid would be able to conjure up the most astonishing forms, which are not phantasms, but realities." "That may be so," growled Polcrab, "but I have been to the island by daylight, And what did I find there? Human bones, new and ancient. Those are Earthrid's victims, and you, wife, shall not go." "But will that music play tonight?" asked Maskell. "Yes," replied Gleemiel, gazing at him intently. "When Tyrgeld rises, which is our moon. If Earthrid plays men to death, it appears to me that his own death is due. In any case, I should like to hear those sounds for myself. But as for taking you with me, Gleemiel, women die too easily in Tormance. I've only just now washed myself clean of the death blood of another woman." Gleemiel laughed, but said nothing. "Now go to sleep," said Pole Crab. "When the time comes, I will take you across myself." He lay down again and closed his eyes. Maskell followed his example, but Gleemiel remained sitting erect, with her legs under her. "Who was that other woman, Maskell?" she asked presently. He did not answer, but pretended to sleep. Chapter 15. Swalone's Island. When he awoke, the day was not so bright, and he guessed it was late afternoon. Pole Crab and his wife were both on their feet, and another meal of fish had been cooked and was waiting for him. "Is it decided who is to go with me?" he asked, before sitting down. "I go," said Gleemiel. "Do you agree, Pole Crab?" The fisherman growled a little in his throat and motioned to the others to take their seats. He took a mouthful before answering. "Something strong is attracting her, and I can't hold her back. I don't think I shall see you again, wife, but the lads are now nearly old enough to fend for themselves." "Don't take dejected views," replied Gleemiel sternly. She was not eating. "I shall come back and make amends to you. It's only for a night." Maskell gazed from one to the other in perplexity. "Let me go alone. I would be sorry if anything happened." Gleemiel shook her head. "Don't regard this as a woman's caprice," she said. "Even if you hadn't passed this way, I would have heard that music soon. I have a hunger for it. Haven't you any such feeling, Pole Crab?" "No. A woman is a noble and sensitive creature, and there are attractions in nature too subtle for males. Take her with you, since she is set on it. Maybe she's right. Perhaps Earthrid's music will answer your questions, and hers too." "What are your questions, Gleemiel?" The woman shed a strange smile. "You may be sure that a question which requires music for an answer can't be put into words. If you are not back by the morning," remarked her husband, "I will know you are dead." The meal was finished in a constrained silence. Pole Crab wiped his mouth and produced a seashell from a kind of pocket. "Will you say goodbye to the boys? Shall I call them?" She considered a moment. Yes, I must see them." He put the shell to his mouth and blew. A loud, mournful noise passed through the air. A few minutes later there was a sound of scurrying footsteps, and the boys were seen emerging from the forest. Maskell looked with curiosity at the first children he had seen on Tormance. The oldest boy was carrying the youngest on his back, while the third trotted some distance behind. The child was let down, and all the three formed a semicircle in front of Maskell, standing staring up at him with wide open eyes. Pole Crab looked on stolidly, but Gleemiel glanced away from them, with proudly raised head and a baffling expression. Maskell put the ages of the boys at about 9, 7, and 5 years, respectively, but he was calculating according to Earth time. The eldest was tall, slim, but strongly built. He, like his brothers, was naked, and his skin from top to toe was ulfire-colored. His facial muscles indicated a wild and daring nature, and his eyes were like green fires. The second showed promise of being a broad, powerful man. His head was large and heavy, and drooped. His face and skin were reddish. His eyes were almost too somber and penetrating for a child's. "That one," said Pole Crab, pinching the boy's ear, "may perhaps grow up to be a second Broodvile." "Who was that?" demanded the boy, bending his head forward to hear the answer. "A big old man, of marvelous wisdom. He became wise by making up his mind never to ask questions, but to find things out for himself. If I had not asked this question, I should not have known about him." "That would not have mattered," replied the father. The youngest child was paler and slighter than his brothers. His face was mostly tranquil and expressionless, but it had this peculiarity about it that every few minutes, without any apparent cause, it would wrinkle up and look perplexed. At these times, his eyes, which were of a tawny gold, seemed to contain secrets difficult to associate with one of his age. "He puzzles me," said Pole Crab. "He has a soul like sap, and he's interested in nothing. He may turn out to be the most remarkable of the bunch." Maskell took the child in one hand and lifted him as high as his head. He took a good look at him and set him down again. The boy never changed countenance. "What do you make of him?" asked the fisherman. "It's on the tip of my tongue to say, but it just escapes me. Let me drink again, and then I shall have it." "Go and drink, then." Maskell strode over to the tree, drank, and returned. "In ages to come," he said, speaking deliberately, "he will be a grand and awful tradition. A seer, possibly, or even a divinity. Watch over him well." The eldest boy looked scornful. "I want to be none of those things. I would like to be like that big fellow." And he pointed his finger at Maskell. He laughed and showed his white teeth through his beard. "Thanks for the compliments, old warrior," he said. "He's great and brawny," continued the boy, "and can hold his own with other men. Can you hold me up with one arm, as you did that child?" Maskell complied. "That is being a man," exclaimed the boy. "Enough," said Pole Crab impatiently. "I called you lads here to say goodbye to your mother. She is going away with this man. I think she may not return, but we don't know." The second boy's face became suddenly inflamed. "Is she going of her own choice?" he inquired. "Yes," replied the father. "Then she is bad." He brought the words out with such force and emphasis that they sounded like the crack of a whip. The old man cuffed him twice. "Is it your mother you are speaking of?" The boy stood his ground without change of expression, but said nothing. The youngest child spoke for the first time. "My mother will not come back, but she will die dancing." Pole Crab and his wife looked at one another. "Where are you going to, mother?" asked the eldest lad. Gleamiel bent down and kissed him. "To the island." "Well then, if you don't come back by tomorrow morning, I will go and look for you." Maskell grew more and more uneasy in his mind. "This seems to me to be a man's journey," he said. "I think it would be better for you not to come, Gleamiel." "I am not to be dissuaded," she replied. He stroked his beard in perplexity. "Is it time to start?" "It wants 4 hours to sunset, and we shall need all that." Maskell sighed. "I'll go to the mouth of the creek and wait there for you and the raft. You will wish to make your farewells, Gleamiel." He then clasped Pole Crab by the hand. "Adieu, fisherman." "You have repaid me well for my answers," said the old man gruffly. "But it's not your fault, and in Shaping's world, the worst things happen." The eldest boy came close to Maskell and frowned at him. "Farewell, big man," he said. "But guard my mother well as you are well able to, or I shall follow you and kill you." Maskell walked slowly along the creek bank till he came to the bend. The glorious sunshine and the sparkling, brilliant sea then met his eyes again, and all melancholy was swept out of his mind. He continued as far as the seashore, and issuing out of the shadows of the forest, strolled on to the sands and sat down in the full sunlight. The radiance of Alpane had long since disappeared. He drank in the hot, invigorating wind, listened to the hissing waves, and stared over the colored sea with its pinnacles and currents at Swaylone's island. What music can that be, which tears a wife and mother away from all she loves the most? He meditated. It sounds unholy. Will it tell me what I want to know? Can it? In a little while he became aware of a movement behind him, and, turning his head, he saw the raft floating along the creek toward the open sea. Polecrab was standing upright, propelling it with a rude pole. He passed by Maskell without looking at him or making any salutation, and proceeded out to sea. While he was wondering at this strange behavior, Gleamiel and the boys came in sight, walking along the bank of the inlet. The eldest born was holding her hand and talking, and the other two were behind. She was calm and smiling, but seemed abstracted. "What is your husband doing with the raft?" asked Maskell. "He's putting it in position, and we shall wade out and join it," she answered, in her low-toned voice. "But how shall we make the island without oars or sails? Don't you see that current running away from land? See, he is approaching it. That will take us straight there. But how can you get back? There is a way, but we need not think of that today." "Why shouldn't I come too?" demanded the eldest boy. "Because the raft won't carry 3. Maskell is a heavy man." "It doesn't matter," said the boy. "I know where there is wood for another raft. As soon as you have gone, I shall set to work." Polecrab had by this time maneuvered his flimsy craft to the position he desired, within a few yards of the current, which at that point made a sharp bend from the east. He shouted out some words to his wife and Maskell. Gleamiel kissed her children convulsively and broke down a little. The eldest boy bit his lip till it bled, and tears glistened in his eyes, but the younger children stared wide-eyed and displayed no emotion. Gleamiel now walked into the sea, followed by Maskell. The water covered first their ankles, then their knees, but when it came as high as their waists, they were close on the raft. Polecrab let himself down into the water and assisted his wife to climb over the side. When she was up, she bent down and kissed him. No words were exchanged. Maskell scrambled up onto the front part of the raft. The woman sat cross-legged in the stem and seized the pole. Polecrab shoved them off toward the current, while she worked her pole until they had got within its power. The raft immediately began to travel swiftly away from land, with a smooth, swaying motion. The boys waved from the shore. Gleamiel responded, but Maskell turned his back squarely to land and gazed ahead. Polecrab was wading back to the shore. For upward of an hour, Maskell did not change his position by an inch. No sound was heard, but the splashing of the strange waves all around them, and the stream-like gurgle of the current, which threaded its way smoothly through the tossing, tumultuous sea. From their pathway of safety, the beautiful dangers surrounding them were an exhilarating experience. The air was fresh and clean, and the heat from Branch Spell, now low in the west, was at last endurable. The riot of sea colors had long since banished all sadness and anxiety from his heart. Yet he felt such a grudge against the woman for selfishly forsaking those who should have been dear to her, that he could not bring himself to begin a conversation. But when, over the now enlarged shape of the dark island, he caught sight of a long chain of lofty, distant mountains, glowing salmon-pink in the evening sunlight, he felt constrained to break the silence by inquiring what they were. "It is Lich-Storm," said Gleamiel. Maskell asked no questions about it. but in turning to address her, his eyes had rested on the rapidly receding Wombflash forest, and he continued to stare at that. They had traveled about 8 miles, and now he could better estimate the Enor 368 mouse height of the trees. Overtopping them, far away, he saw Sant, and he fancied, but was not quite sure, that he could distinguish Discorn as well. "Now that we are alone in a strange place," said Gleamiel, averting her head and looking down over the side of the raft into the water. "Tell me what you thought of Pole Crab." Muscle paused before answering. "He seemed to me like a mountain wrapped in cloud. You see the lower buttresses and think that is all. But then high up, far above the clouds, you suddenly catch sight of more mountain, and even then it is not the top. You read character well, and have great perception," remarked Gleamiel quietly. "Now say what I am. In place of a human heart, you have a wild harp, and that's all I know about you. What was that you said to my husband about 2 worlds? You heard?" "Yes, I heard, and I also am conscious of 2 worlds. My husband and boys are real to me, and I love them fondly. But there is another world for me, as there is for you, Maskull, and it makes my real world appear all false and vulgar. Perhaps we are seeking the same thing, but can it be right to satisfy our self-nature at the expense of other people? No, it's not right. It is wrong and base. But in that other world, these words have no meaning." There was a silence. "It's useless to discuss such topics," said Maskull. "The choice is now out of our hands, and we must go where we are taken. What I would rather speak about is what awaits us on the island. I am ignorant, except that we shall find Earthrid there. Who is Earthrid, and why is it called Swaylone's Island? They say Earthrid came from Thriel, but I know nothing else about him. As for Swaylone, if you like, I will tell you his legend." "If you please," said Maskull. "In a far back age," began Gleamiel, "when the seas were hot and clouds hung heavily over the earth, and life was rich with transformations, Swaylone came to this island, on which men had never before set foot, and began to play his music, the first music in Tormance. Nightly, when the moon shone, people used to gather on this shore behind us and listen to the faint, sweet strains floating from over the sea. One night, Shaping, whom you call Crystal Man, was passing this way in company with Crag. They listened a while to the music, and Shaping said, 'Have you heard more beautiful sounds? This is my world and my music.' Crag stamped with his foot and laughed. 'You must do better than that, if I am to admire it. Let us pass over and see this bungler at work.' Shaping consented, and they passed over to the island. Swaylone was not able to see their presence. Shaping stood behind him and breathed thoughts into his soul, so that his music became 10 times lovelier, and people listening on that shore went mad with sick delight. 'Can any strains be nobler?' demanded Shaping. Crag grinned and said, 'You are naturally effeminate. Now let me try.' Then he stood behind Swaylone and shot ugly discords fast into his head. His instrument was so cracked that never since has it played right. From that time forth, Swaylone could utter only distorted music, yet it called to folk more than the other sort. Many men crossed over to the island during his lifetime to listen to the amazing tones, but none could endure them. All died. After Swaylone's death, another musician took up the tale, and so the light has passed down from torch to torch, till now Earthrid bears it." "An interesting legend," commented Maskull. "But who is Crag?" "They say that when the world was born, Crag was born with it, a spirit compounded of those vestiges of Muspel which Shaping did not know how to transform. Thereafter nothing has gone right with the world, for he dogs Shaping's footsteps everywhere, and whatever the latter does, he undoes. To love he joins death, to sex, shame, to intellect, madness, to virtue, cruelty, and to fair exteriors, bloody entrails. These are Crag's actions, so the lovers of the world call him Devil. They don't understand, Maskell, that without him the world would lose its beauty. Crag and beauty, exclaimed he, with a cynical smile. Even so, that same beauty which you and I are now voyaging to discover, that beauty for whose sake I am renouncing husband, children, and happiness. Did you imagine beauty to be pleasant? Surely. That pleasant beauty is an insipid compound of shaping. To see beauty in its terrible purity, you must tear away the pleasure from it. Do you say I am going to seek beauty, Gleamiel? Such an idea is far from my mind. She did not respond to his remark. After waiting for a few minutes to hear if she would speak again, he turned his back on her once more. There was no more talk until they reached the island. The air had grown chill and damp by the time they approached its shores. Branchspel was on the point of touching the sea. The island appeared to be some 3 or 4 miles in length. There were first of all broad sands, then low, dark cliffs, and behind these, a wilderness of insignificant swelling hills, entirely devoid of vegetation. The current bore them to within 100 yards of the coast, when it made a sharp angle and proceeded to skirt the length of the land. Gleamiel jumped overboard and began swimming to shore. Maskell followed her example, and the raft, abandoned, was rapidly borne away by the current. They soon touched ground and were able to wade the rest of the way. By the time they reached dry land, the sun had set. Gleamiel made straight for the hills, and Maskell, after casting a single glance at the low, dim outline of the Womflash forest, followed her. The cliffs were soon scrambled up, then the ascent was gentle and easy, while the rich, dry, brown mold was good to walk upon. A little way off on their left, something white was shining. "You need not go to it," said the woman. "It can be nothing else than one of those skeletons Polecrab talked about. And look, there is another one over there." "This brings it home," remarked Maskell, smiling. "There is nothing comical in having died for beauty," said Gleamiel, bending her brows at him, and when in the course of their walk, he saw the innumerable human bones, from gleaming white to dirty yellow, lying scattered about as if it were a naked graveyard among the hills, he agreed with her, and fell into a somber mood. It was still light when they reached the highest point, and could set eyes on the other side. The sea to the north of the island was in no way different from that which they had crossed, but its lively colors were fast becoming invisible. "That is matter play," said the woman, pointing her finger toward some low land on the horizon, which seemed to be even farther off than Womflash. "I wonder how Digrung passed over," meditated Maskell. Not far away, in a hollow enclosed by a circle of little hills, they saw a small circular lake, not more than half a mile in diameter. The sunset colors of the sky were reflected in its waters. "That must be Irontic," remarked Gleamiel. "What is that?" "I have heard that it's the instrument Earthrid plays on. We are getting close," responded he. "Let us go and investigate." When they drew nearer, they observed that a man was reclining on the farther side, in an attitude of sleep. "If that's not the man himself, who can it be?" said Maskell. "Let's get across the water, if it will bear us. It will save time." He now assumed the lead, and took running strides down the slope which bounded the lake on that side. Gleamiel followed him with greater dignity, keeping her eyes fixed on the recumbent man as if fascinated. When Maskell reached the water's edge, he tried it with one foot, to discover if it would carry his weight. Something unusual in its appearance led him to have doubts. It was a tranquil, dark, and beautifully reflecting sheet of water. It resembled a mirror of liquid metal. Finding that it would bear him and that nothing happened, he placed his second foot on its surface. Instantly, he sustained a violent shock throughout his body, as from a powerful electric current, and he was hurled in a tumbled heap back onto the bank. He picked himself up, brushed the dirt off his person, and started walking around the lake. Gleemiel joined him, and they completed the half-circuit together. They came to the man, and Maskell prodded him with his foot. He woke up and blinked at them. His face was pale, weak, and vacant-looking, and had a disagreeable expression. There were thin sprouts of black hair on his chin and head. On his forehead, in place of a third eye, he possessed a perfectly circular organ with elaborate convolutions, like an ear. He had an unpleasant smell. He appeared to be of young middle age. "Wake up, man," said Maskell sharply, "and tell us if you are Earthrid." "What time is it?" counter-questioned the man. "Does it want long to moonrise?" Without appearing to care about an answer, he sat up, and turning away from them, began to scoop up the loose soil with his hand, and to eat it half-heartedly. "Now, how can you eat that filth?" demanded Maskell in disgust. "Don't be angry, Maskell," said Gleemiel, laying hold of his arm and flushing a little. "It is Earthrid, the man who is to help us." "He has not said so." "I am Earthrid," said the other in his weak and muffled voice, which, however, suddenly struck Maskell as being autocratic. "What do you want here? Or rather, you had better get away as quickly as you can, for it will be too late when Tyrgeld rises." "You need not explain," exclaimed Maskell. "We know your reputation, and we have come to hear your music. But what's that organ for on your forehead?" Earthrid glared and smiled and glared again. "That is for rhythm, which is what changes noise into music. Don't stand and argue, but go away. It is no pleasure to me to people the island with corpses. They corrupt the air and do nothing else." Darkness now crept swiftly on over the landscape. "You are rather big-mouthed," said Maskell coolly. "But after we have heard you play, perhaps I shall adventure a tune myself." "You? Are you a musician then? Do you even know what music is?" A flame danced in Gleemiel's eyes. "Maskell thinks music reposes in the instrument," she said in her intense way. "But it is in the soul of the master." "Yes," said Earthrid, "but that is not all. I will tell you what it is. In Threel, where I was born and brought up, we learn the mystery of the three in nature. This world, which lies extended before us, has three directions. Length is the line which shuts off what is from what is not. Breadth is the surface which shows us in what manner one thing of what is lives with another thing. Depth is the path which leads from what is to our own body. In music, it is not otherwise. Tone is X's 380 tenths, without which nothing at all can be. Symmetry and numbers are the manner in which tones exist, one with another. Emotion is the movement of our soul toward the wonderful world that is being created. Now men, when they make music, are accustomed to build beautiful tones because of the delight they cause. Therefore their music world is based on pleasure. Its symmetry is regular and charming. Its emotion is sweet and lovely. But my music is founded on painful tones, and thus its symmetry is wild and difficult to discover. Its emotion is bitter and terrible. If I had not anticipated its being original, I would not have come here, said Maskell. Still, Explain. Why can't harsh tones have simple symmetry of form? And why must they necessarily cause more profound emotions in us who listen? Pleasures may harmonize, pains must clash, and in the order of their clashing lies the symmetry. The emotions follow the music, which is rough and earnest. You may call it music, remarked Maskell thoughtfully, but to me, it bears a closer resemblance to actual life. If Shaping's plans had gone straight, life would have been like that other sort of music. He who seeks can find traces of that intention in the world of nature. But as it has turned out, real life resembles my music, and mine is the true music. Shall we see living shapes? I don't know what my mood will be, returned Earthrid, but when I have finished, you shall adventure your tune and produce whatever shapes you please, unless indeed the tune is out of your own big body. The shocks you are preparing may kill us, said Gleamiel in a low, taut voice, but we shall die seeing beauty. Earthrid looked at her with a dignified expression. Neither you nor any other person can endure the thoughts which I put into my music. Still, you must have it your own way. It needed a woman to call it beauty. But if this is beauty, what is ugliness? That I can tell you, master, replied Gleamiel, smiling at him. Ugliness is old, stale life, while yours every night issues fresh from the womb of nature. Earthrid stared at her, without response. Tyrgeld is rising, he said at last, and now you shall see, though not for long. As the words left his mouth, the full moon peeped over the hills in the dark eastern sky. They watched it in silence, and soon it was wholly up. It was larger than the moon of Earth, and seemed nearer. Its shadowy parts stood out in just as strong relief, but somehow it did not give Maskell the impression of being a dead world. Branch spells shone on the whole of it, but Alpane only on a part. The broad crescent that reflected Branch spell's rays alone was white and brilliant, but the part that was illuminated by both suns shone with a greenish radiance that had almost solar power, and yet was cold and cheerless. On gazing at that combined light, he felt the same sense of disintegration that the afterglow of Alpane had always caused in him. But now the feeling was not physical, but merely aesthetic. The moon did not appear romantic to him, but disturbing and mystical. Earthrid rose and stood quietly for a minute. In the bright moonlight, his face seemed to have undergone a change. It lost its loose, weak, disagreeable look, and acquired a sort of crafty grandeur. He clapped his hands together meditatively 2 or 3 times, and walked up and down. The others stood together, watching him. Then he sat down by the side of the lake, and leaning on his side, placed his right hand, open palm downward, on the ground, at the same time stretching out his right leg, so that the foot was in contact with the water. While Maskell was in the act of staring at him and at the lake, he felt a stabbing sensation right through his heart, as though he had been pierced by a rapier. He barely recovered himself from falling, and as he did so, he saw that a spout had formed on the water and was now subsiding again. The next moment he was knocked down by a violent blow in the mouth, delivered by an invisible hand. He picked himself up and observed that a second spout had formed. No sooner was he on his legs than a hideous pain hammered away inside his brain, as if caused by a malignant tumor. In his agony, he stumbled and fell again. This time on the arm Crow had wounded. All his other mishaps were forgotten in this one, which half stunned him. It lasted only a moment, and then sudden relief came, and he found that Earthrid's rough music had lost its power over him. He saw him still stretched in the same position. Spouts were coming thick and fast on the lake, which was full of lively motion. But But Gleamiel was not on her legs. She was lying on the ground, in a heap, without moving. Her attitude was ugly, and he guessed she was dead. When he reached her, he discovered that she was dead. In what state of mind she had died, he did not know, for her face wore the vulgar Crystal Man grin. The whole tragedy had not lasted 5 minutes. He went over to Earthrid and dragged him forcibly away from his playing. "You have been as good as your word, musician," he said. "Gleamiel is dead." Earthrid tried to collect his scattered senses. "I warned her," he replied, sitting up. "Did I not beg her to go away? But she died very easily. She did not wait for the beauty she spoke about. She heard nothing of the passion, nor even of the rhythm. Neither have you." Maskell looked down at him in indignation, but said nothing. "You should not have interrupted me," went on Earthrid. "When I am playing, nothing else is of importance. I might have lost the thread of my ideas. Fortunately, I never forget. I shall start over again. If music is to continue, in the presence of the dead, I play next." The man glanced up quickly. "That can't be." "It must be," said Maskell decisively. "I prefer playing to listening. Another reason is that you will have every night, but I have only tonight." Earthrid clenched and unclenched his fist and began to turn pale. "With your recklessness, you are likely to kill us both. Irontic belongs to me, and until you have learned how to play, you would only break the instrument. Well then, I will break it, but I am going to try." The musician jumped to his feet and confronted him. "Do you intend to take it from me by violence? Keep calm. You will have the same choice that you offered us. I shall give you time to go away somewhere. How will that serve me if you spoil my lake? You don't understand what you are doing. Go or stay," responded Maskell. "I give you till the water gets smooth again. After that, I begin playing." Earthrid kept swallowing. He glanced at the lake and back to Maskell. "Do you swear it? How long that will take, you know better than I. But till then, you are safe." Earthrid cast him a look of malice, hesitated for an instant, and then moved away and started to climb the nearest hill. Halfway up, he glanced over his shoulder apprehensively, as if to see what was happening. In another minute or so, he had disappeared over the crest, traveling in the direction of the shore that faced Matterplay. Later, when the water was once more tranquil, Maskell sat down by its edge, in imitation of Earthrid's attitude. He knew neither how to set about producing his music, nor what would come of it, but audacious projects entered his brain, and he willed to create physical shapes, and, above all, one shape, that of Surtur. Before putting his foot to the water, he turned things over a little in his mind. He said, "What themes are in common music, shapes are in this music. The composer does not find his theme by picking out single notes, but the whole theme that flashes into his mind by inspiration. So it must be with shapes. When I start playing, if I am worth anything, the undivided ideas will pass from my unconscious mind to this lake, and then, reflected back in the dimensions of reality, I shall be for the first time made acquainted with them. So it must be." The instant his foot touched the water, he felt his thoughts flowing from him. He did not know what they were, but the mere act of flowing created a sensation of joyful mastery. With this was curiosity to learn what they would prove to be. Spouts formed on the lake in increasing numbers, but he experienced no pain. His thoughts, which he knew to be music, did not issue from him in a steady, unbroken stream, but in great rough gushes, succeeding intervals of quiescence. When these gushes came, the whole lake broke out in an eruption of spouts. He realized that the ideas passing from him did not arise in his intellect, but had their source in the fathomless depths of his will. He could not decide what character they should have, but he was able to force them out, or retard them, by the exercise of his volition. At first, nothing changed around him. Then the moon grew dimmer, and a strange new radiance began to illuminate the landscape. It increased so imperceptibly that it was some time before he recognized it as the Muspel light which he had seen in the Wombflash forest. He could not give it a color or a name, but it filled him with a sort of stern and sacred awe. He called up the resources of his powerful will. The spouts thickened like a forest, and many of them were 20 feet high. Tyrgeld looked faint and pale. The radiance became intense, but it cast no shadows. The wind got up, but where Maskell was sitting, it was calm. Shortly afterward, it began to shriek and whistle like a full gale. He saw no shapes and redoubled his efforts. His ideas were now rushing out onto the lake so furiously that his whole soul was possessed by exhilaration and defiance. But still, he did not know their nature. A huge spout shot up, and at the same moment the hills began to crack and break. Great masses of loose soil were erupted from their bowels, and in the next period of quietness, he saw that the landscape had altered. Still, the mysterious light intensified. The moon disappeared entirely. The noise of the unseen tempest was terrifying, but Maskell played heroically on, trying to urge out ideas which would take shape. The hillsides were cleft with chasms. The water escaping from the tops of the spouts swamped the land. But where he was, it was dry. The radiance grew terrible. It was everywhere, but Maskell fancied that it was far brighter in one particular quarter. He thought that it was becoming localized, preparatory to contracting into a solid form. He strained and strained. Immediately afterward, the bottom of the lake subsided. Its waters fell through, and his instrument was broken. The Muspel light vanished. The moon shone out again, but Maskell could not see it. After that unearthly shining, he seemed to himself to be in total blackness. The screaming wind ceased. There was a dead silence. His thoughts finished flowing toward the lake, and his foot no longer touched water, but hung in space. He was too stunned by the suddenness of the change to either think or feel. While he was still lying dazed, a vast explosion occurred in the newly opened depths beneath the lake bed. The water in its descent had met fire. Maskell was lifted bodily in the air, many yards high, and came down heavily. He lost consciousness. When he came to his senses again, he saw everything. Tyrgeld was gleaming brilliantly. He was lying by the side of the old lake, but it was now a crater, to the bottom of which his eyes could not penetrate. The hills encircling it were torn, as if by heavy gunfire. A few thunderclouds were floating in the air at no great height, from which branched lightning descended to the earth incessantly, accompanied by alarming and singular crashes. He got on his legs and tested his actions. Finding that he was uninjured, he first of all viewed the crater at closer quarters, and then started to walk painfully toward the northern shore. When he had attained the crest above the lake, the landscape sloped gently down for 2 miles to the sea. Everywhere he passed through traces of his rough work. The country was carved into scarps, grooves, channels, and craters. He arrived at the line of low cliffs overlooking the beach, and found that these also were partly broken down by landslips. He got down onto the sand, and stood looking over the moonlit, agitated sea, wondering how he could contrive to escape from this island of failure. Then he saw Earthreed's body, lying quite close to him. It was on its back. Both legs had been violently torn off, and he could not see them anywhere. Earthreed's teeth were buried in the flesh of his right forearm. indicating that the man had died in unreasoning physical agony. The skin gleamed green in the moonlight, but it was stained by darker discolorations, which were wounds. The sand about him was dyed by the pool of blood which had long since filtered through. Maskell left the corpse in dismay and walked a long way along the sweet-smelling shore. Sitting down on a rock, he waited for daybreak. Chapter 16. Lee Halfay. At midnight, when Tyrgeld was in the south, throwing his shadows straight toward the sea and making everything nearly as bright as day, he saw a great tree floating in the water, not far out. It was 30 feet out of the water, upright and alive, and its roots must have been enormously deep and wide. It was drifting along the coast through the heavy seas. Maskell eyed it incuriously for a few minutes. Then it dawned on him that it might be a good thing to investigate its nature. Without stopping to weigh the danger, he immediately swam out, caught hold of the lowest branch, and swung himself up. He looked aloft and saw that the main stem was thick to the very top, terminating in a knob that somewhat resembled a human head. He made his way toward this knob, through the multitude of boughs, which were covered with tough, slippery marine leaves like seaweed. Arriving at the crown, he found that it actually was a sort of head, for there were Mem 394 brains like rudimentary eyes all the way around it, denoting some form of low intelligence. At that moment, the tree touched bottom, though some way from the shore, and began to bump heavily. To steady himself, Maskell put his hand out, and in doing so, accidentally covered some of the membranes. The tree sheared off the land, as if by an act of will. When it was steady again, Maskell removed his hand. They at once drifted back to shore. He thought a bit, and then started experimenting with the eye-like membranes. It was as he had guessed. These eyes were stimulated by the light of the moon, and whichever way the light came from, the tree would travel. A rather defiant smile crossed Maskell's face as it struck him that it might be possible to navigate this huge plant animal as far as matter play. He lost no time in putting the conception into execution. Tearing off some of the long, tough leaves, he bound up all the membranes, except the ones that faced the north. The tree instantly left the island and definitely put out to sea. It traveled due north. It was not moving at more than a mile an hour, however, while matter play was possibly 40 miles distant. The great spout waves fell against the trunk with mighty thuds. The breaking seas hissed through the lower branches. Maskell rested high and dry, but was more than a little apprehensive about their slow rate of progress. Presently he sighted a current racing along toward the northwest, and that put another idea into his head. He began to juggle with the membranes again, and before long had succeeded in piloting his tree into the fast-running stream. As soon as they were fairly in its rapids, he blinded the crown entirely, and thenceforward the current acted in the double capacity of road and steed. Maskell made himself secure among the branches and slept for the remainder of the night. When his eyes opened again, the island was out of sight. Tyrgeld was setting in the western sea. The sky in the east was bright with the colors of the approaching day. The air was cool and fresh. The light over the sea was beautiful, gleaming, and mysterious. Land, probably matter play, lay ahead, a long dark line of low cliffs, perhaps a mile away. The current no longer ran toward the shore, but began to skirt the coast without drawing any closer to it. As soon as Maskell realized the fact, he maneuvered the tree out of its channel and started drifting it inshore. The eastern sky blazed up suddenly with violent dyes, and the outer rim of branch spell lifted itself above the sea. The moon had already sunk. The shore loomed nearer and nearer. In physical character, it was like Swaylone's island. The same wide sands, small cliffs, and rounded, insignificant hills inland, without vegetation. In the early morning sunlight, however, it looked romantic. Maskell, hollow-eyed and morose, cared nothing for all that. But the moment the tree grounded, clambered swiftly down through the branches and dropped into the sea. By the time he had swam ashore, the white, stupendous sun was high above the horizon. He walked along the sands toward the east for a considerable distance, without having any special intention in his mind. He thought he would go on until he came to some creek or valley, and then turn up it. The sun's rays were cheering, and began to relieve him of his oppressive night weight. After strolling along the beach for about a mile, he was stopped by a broad stream that flowed into the sea out of a kind of natural gateway in the line of cliffs. Its water was of a beautiful, limpid green, all filled with bubbles. So ice-cold, aerated, and enticing did it look that he flung himself face downward on the ground and took a prolonged draught. When he got up again, his eyes started to play pranks. They became alternately blurted and clear. It may have been pure imagination, but he fancied that Digrung was moving inside him. He followed the bank of the stream through the gap in the cliffs, and then for the first time saw the real matter play. A valley appeared, like a jewel enveloped by naked rock. All the hill country was bare and lifeless, but this valley lying in the heart of it was extremely fertile. He had never seen such fertility. It wound up among the hills, and all that he was looking at was its broad lower end. The floor of the valley was about half a mile wide. The stream that ran down its middle was nearly 100 feet across, but was exceedingly shallow, in most places not more than a few inches deep. The sides of the valley were about 70 feet high, but very sloping. They were clothed from top to bottom with little, bright-leaved trees, not of varied tints of one color, like earth trees, but of widely diverse colors, most of which were brilliant and positive. The floor itself was like a magician's garden. Densely interwoven trees, shrubs, and parasitical climbers fought everywhere for possession of it. The forms were strange and grotesque, and each one seemed different. The colors of leaf, flower, sexual organs, and stem were equally peculiar. All the different combinations of the 5 primary colors of torments seemed to be represented, and the result, for Maskell, was a sort of eye chaos. So rank was the vegetation that he could not fight his way through it. He was obliged to take to the riverbed. The contact of the water created an odd tingling sensation throughout his body, like a mild electric shock. There were no birds, but a few extraordinary-looking winged reptiles of small size kept crossing the valley from hill to hill. Swarms of flying insects clustered around him, threatening mischief. But in the end it turned out that his blood was disagreeable to them, for he was not bitten once. Repulsive crawling creatures resembling centipedes, scorpions, snakes, and so forth were in myriads on the banks of the stream, but they also made no attempt to use their weapons on his bare legs and feet as he passed through them into the water. Presently, however, he was confronted in midstream by a hideous monster of the size of a pony, but resembling in shape, if it resembled anything, a sea crustacean. And then he came to a halt. They stared at one another, the beast with wicked eyes, Maskell with cool and wary ones. While he was staring, a singular thing happened to him. His eyes blurred again, but when in a minute or two this blurring passed away, and he saw clearly once more, his vision had changed in character. He was looking right through the animal's body and could distinguish all its interior parts. The outer crust, however, and all the hard tissues were misty and semi-transparent. Through them a luminous network of blood-red veins and arteries stood out in startling distinctness. The hard parts faded away to nothingness, and the blood system alone was left. Not even the fleshy ducts remained. The naked blood alone was visible, flowing this way and that like a fiery liquid skeleton in the shape of the monster. Then this blood began to change too. Instead of a continuous liquid stream, Maskell perceived that it was composed of 1,000,000 individual points. The red color had been an illusion caused by the rapid motion of the points. He now saw clearly that they resembled minute suns in their scintillating brightness. They seemed like a double drift of stars streaming through space. One drift was traveling toward a fixed point in the center, while the other was moving away from it. He recognized the former as the veins of the beast, the latter as the arteries, and the fixed point as the heart. While he was still looking, lost in amazement, the starry network went out suddenly like an extinguished flame. Where the crustacean had stood, there was nothing. Yet through this nothing, he could not see the landscape. Something was standing there that intercepted the light, though it possessed neither shape, color, nor substance, and now the object, which could no longer be perceived by vision, began to be felt by emotion, a delightful spring-like sense of rising sap, of quickening pulses of love, adventure, mystery, beauty, femininity, took possession of his being, and, strangely enough, he identified it with the monster. Why that invisible brute should cause him to feel young, sexual, and audacious, he did not ask himself, for he was fully occupied with the effect. But it was as if flesh, bones, and blood had been discarded, and he were face to face with naked life itself, which slowly passed into his own body. The sensations died away. There was a brief interval, and then the streaming star-like skeleton rose up again out of space. It changed to the red blood system. The hard parts of the body reappeared with more and more distinctness, and at the same time the network of blood grew fainter. Presently the interior parts were entirely concealed by the crust. The creature stood opposite Maskell in its old formidable ugliness, hard, painted, and concrete. Disliking something about him, the crustacean turned aside and stumbled awkwardly away on its 6 legs, with laborious and repulsive movements, toward the other bank of the stream. Maskell's apathy left him after this adventure. He became uneasy and thoughtful. He imagined that he was beginning to see things through De Grung's eyes, and that there were strange troubles immediately ahead. The next time his eyes started to blur, he fought it down with his will, and nothing happened. The valley ascended with many windings toward the hills. It narrowed considerably, and the wooded slopes on either side grew steeper and higher. The stream shrunk to about 20 feet across, but it was deeper. It was alive with motion, music, and bubbles. The electric sensations caused by its water became more pronounced, almost disagreeably so. But there was nowhere else to walk. With its deafening confusion of sounds from the multitude of living creatures, the little valley resembled a vast conversation hall of nature. The life was still more prolific than before. Every square foot of space was a tangle of struggling wills, both animal and vegetable. For a naturalist, it would have been paradise, for no two shapes were alike and all were fantastic, with individual character. It looked as if life forms were being coined so fast by nature that there was not physical room for all. Nevertheless, it was not as on Earth, where 100 seeds are scattered in order that one may be sown. Here the young forms seemed to survive, while to find accommodation for them, the old ones perished. Everywhere he looked, they were withering and dying, without any ostensible cause. They were simply being killed by new life. Other creatures sported so wildly in front of his very eyes that they became of different kingdoms altogether. For example, A fruit was lying on the ground, of the size and shape of a lemon, but with a tougher skin. He picked it up, intending to eat the contained pulp, but inside it was a fully formed young tree, just on the point of bursting its shell. Maskell threw it away upstream. It floated back toward him. By the time he was even with it, its downward motion had stopped, and it was swimming against the current. He fished it out and discovered that it had sprouted 6 rudimentary legs. Maskell sang no paeans of praise in honor of the gloriously overcrowded valley. On the contrary, he felt deeply cynical and depressed. He thought that the unseen power, whether it was called nature, life, will, or God, that was so frantic to rush forward and occupy this small, vulgar, contemptible world, could not possess very high aims and was not worth much. How this sordid struggle for an hour or two of physical existence could ever be regarded as a deeply earnest and important business was beyond his comprehension. The atmosphere choked him. He longed for air and space, and thrusting his way through to the side of the ravine, he began to climb the overhanging cliff, swinging his way up from tree to tree. When he arrived at the top, branch spell beat down on him with such brutal, white intensity that he saw that there was no staying there. He looked around to ascertain what part of the country he had come to. He had traveled about 10 miles from the sea, as the crow flies. The bare, undulating wolds sloped straight down toward it. The water glittered in the distance, and on the horizon, he was just able to make out Swaylone's Island. Looking north, the land continued sloping upward as far as he could see. Over the crest, that is to say, some miles away, a line of black, fantastic-shaped rocks of quite another character showed themselves. This was probably Thriel. Behind these again, against the sky, perhaps 50 or even 100 miles off, were the peaks of Lichstorm, most of them covered with greenish snow that glittered in the sunlight. They were stupendously high and of weird contours. Most of them were conical to the top, but from the top, great masses of mountain balanced themselves at what looked like impossible angles, overhanging without apparent support. A land like that promised something new, he thought. Extraordinary inhabitants. The idea took shape in his mind to go there, and to travel as swiftly as possible. It might even be feasible to get there before sunset. It was less the mountains themselves that attracted him than the country which lay beyond. The prospect of setting eyes on the blue sun, which he judged to be the wonder of wonders in Tormence. The direct route was over the hills, but that was out of the question because of the killing heat and the absence of shade. He guessed, however, that the valley would not take him far out of his way, and decided to keep to that for the time being, much as he hated and feared it. Into the hotbed of life, therefore, he once more swung himself. Once down, he continued to follow the windings of the valley for several miles through sunlight and shadow. The path became increasingly difficult. The cliffs closed in on either side until they were less than 100 yards apart, while the bed of the ravine was blocked by boulders, great and small, so that the little stream, which was now diminished to the proportions of a brook, had to come down where and how it could. The forms of life grew stranger. Pure plants and pure animals disappeared by degrees, and their place was filled by singular creatures that seemed to partake of both characters. They had limbs, faces, will, and intelligence, but they remained for the greater part of their time rooted in the ground by preference, and they fed only on soil and air. Maskell saw no sexual organs and failed to understand how the young came into existence. Then he witnessed an astonishing sight. A large and fully developed plant animal appeared suddenly in front of him, out of empty space. He could not believe his eyes, but stared at the creature for a long time in amazement. It went on calmly, moving and burrowing before him, as thought it had been there all its life. Giving up the puzzle, Maskell resumed his striding from rock to rock up the gorge, and then, quietly and without warning, the same phenomenon occurred again. No longer could he doubt that he was seeing miracles, that nature was precipitating its shapes into the world without making use of the medium of parentage. No solution of the problem presented itself. The brook, too, had altered in character. A trembling radiance came up from its green water, like some imprisoned force escaping into the air. He had not walked in it for some time. Now he did so, to test its quality. He felt new life entering his body, from his feet upward. It resembled a slowly moving cordial rather than mere heat. The sensation was quite new in his experience, yet he knew by instinct what it was. The energy emitted by the brook was ascending his body neither as friend nor foe, but simply because it happened to be the direct road to its objective elsewhere. But although it had no hostile intentions, it was likely to prove a rough traveler. He was clearly conscious that its passage through his body threatened to bring about some physical transformation, unless he could do something to prevent it. Leaping quickly out of the water, he leaned against a rock, tightened his muscles, and braced himself against the impending charge. At that very moment, the blurring again attacked his sight, and while he was guarding against that, his forehead sprouted out into a galaxy of new eyes. He put his hand up and counted 6, in addition to his old ones. The danger was past, and Maskell laughed, congratulating himself on having got off so easily. Then he wondered what the new organs were for, whether they were a good or a bad thing. He had not taken a dozen steps up the ravine before he found out. Just as he was in the act of jumping down from the top of a boulder, his vision altered and he came to an automatic standstill. He was perceiving 2 worlds simultaneously. With his own eyes, he saw the gorge as before, with its rocks, brook, plant animals, sunshine, and shadows. But with his acquired eyes, he saw differently. All the details of the valley were visible, but the light seemed turned down, and everything appeared faint, hard, and uncolored. The sun was obscured by masses of cloud which filled the whole sky. This vapor was in violent and almost living motion. It was thick in extension, but thin in texture. Some parts, however, were far denser than others, as the particles were crushed together or swept apart by the motion. The green sparks from the brook, when closely watched, could be distinguished individually, each one wavering up toward the clouds. But the moment they got within them, a fearful struggle seemed to begin. The spark endeavored to escape through to the upper air, while the clouds concentrated around it whichever way it darted, trying to create so dense a prison that further movement would be impossible. As far as Maskell could detect, most of the sparks succeeded eventually in finding their way out after frantic efforts. But one that he was looking at was caught. And what happened was this. A complete ring of cloud surrounded it, and in spite of its furious leaps and flashes in all directions, as if it were a live, savage creature caught in a net, nowhere could it find an opening. But it dragged the N408 enveloping cloud stuff with it, wherever it went. The vapors continued to thicken around it, until they resembled the black, heavy, compressed ski masses seen before a bad thunderstorm. Then the green spark, which was still visible in the interior, ceased its efforts and remained for a time.